Hello, friends. Welcome to this 25th webinar on the Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly P. Hall. This webinar series is available on makara.us under the subheadings Mori Federation Webinars, then Webinar Series in Progress, as shown here. And I think David Hopper has a webinar going on now, right?
Yes, he does. It starts next week on the 10 seed groups.
Okay, I'll update this for next week. So, okay.
And I'd like to also put a plug in. There's another one. When you update that for next week, you'll see the other one. Nicole is doing some esoteric healing teaching webinars, and that's an ongoing series that Joe could probably talk a little bit more about at the end of this webinar, but we've made them, the part of them is public. So
well, that's terrific. Great.
Okay, so sorry, go ahead.
No problem. So, as you all know, this webinar series is also recorded on YouTube. Just do a search for Francis Donald's Secret Teachings or Secret Doctrine. Already, last month, we took a look at an extended excerpt, 4 or 5 pages, from Externalization of the Hierarchy, which gave us a unique perspective that you can only really get from DK, followed by an analysis of what MPH calls the Orphic key to the Atlantic fable, right? Oriented, though, towards the Orphic orientation rather than Atlantis itself. Then we finished up with a look at John Mitchell's geometrical analysis of the measurements of Atlantis as central city as given by Plato, which is kind of interesting. So with this session, we begin a new paragraph of the text. Let's just start with the reader.
I'll start it off today.
Okay.
Either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve 2 widely different ends, or else the accounts preserved by the Egyptian priests were tampered with to perpetuate the secret doctrine. This does not mean to imply that Atlantis is purely mythological, but it overcomes the most serious obstacle to acceptance of the Atlantis theory, namely the fantastic accounts of its origin, size, appearance, and date of destruction. 9600 BC, in the midst of the central island of Atlantis, was a lofty mountain which cast a shadow 5,000 stadia in extent, and whose summit touched the sphere of the aether. This is the axle mountain of the world, sacred among many races and symbolic of the human head, which rises out of the 4 elements of the body. This sacred mountain, upon whose summit stood the temple of the gods, gave rise to the stories of Olympus, Meru, and Asgard. The city of the Golden Gates, the capital of Atlantis, is the one now preserved among numerous religions as the city of the gods, or the holy city. Here is the archetype of the New Jerusalem, with its streets paved with gold and its 12 gates shining with precious stones.
Okay, thanks, Bill. Any thoughts or questions right off the bat? Okay, and you can always jump in anytime and ask a question. So first up, either the initiated Plato used the Atlantis allegory to achieve 2 wildly different ends. I'm reading this quote, 2 different ends, to mean 1, the actual history of physical plane Atlantis, and 2, the myth, didn't mean to do that, there we go, the myth of Atlantis as an allegory for a philosophical teaching. We have an example of the latter in MPH's Orphic Key to the Atlantic Fable. Next, the accounts preserved by the Egyptian priests were tampered with to perpetuate the secret doctrine. HPB seems to think it more likely that the priests modified the story in order to close the door on certain occult practices that the Atlanteans misused. So if we could get a reader for this, please.
Joe, can you read that for us, please?
This knowledge was known to the priests of Egypt and to Plato himself, the solemn oath of secrecy, which extended even to the mysteries of Neoplatonism, alone preventing the whole truth from being told. So secret was the knowledge of the last islands of Atlantis. Indeed, on account of the superhuman powers possessed by its inhabitants, the last direct descendants of the gods or divine kings, as it was thought, that to divulge its whereabouts and existence was punished by death. Had not Diocletian burned the esoteric works of the Egyptians in 296, together with their books on alchemy, Caesar 700,000 rolls at Alexandria, and Leo Isaurus 300,000 rolls at Constantinople, and the Mohammedans all they could lay their sacrilegious hands on, the world might know today more of Atlantis than it does, for alchemy had its birthplace in Atlantis during the Fourth Race and had only its renaissance in Egypt.
Any thoughts about this? So MPH then brings forward as Exhibit A in support of this tampering, the quote, fantastic accounts of its origin, size, appearance, and date of destruction, 9600 BC. Certainly there are blinds among these descriptions, as well as purely allegorical elements in Plato's story. But as MPH suggests, this in no way refutes the physical existence of Atlantis. Okay, next up. In the midst of the central island of Atlantis was a lofty mountain which cast a shadow 5,000 stadia in extent. This is a perfect example of a symbolical statement, which becomes obvious when we take a closer look at these measurements. So a stadion is 600 feet, making 5,000 stadion 3 million feet. Since a mile is 5,280 feet, we get a shadow of ... over 568 miles. I think it's safe to say that no mountain has a literal 568 mile long shadow, no matter how high or at what time of day that shadow is measured. But if we define shadow to mean the mountain's influence, we can see how such a quote-unquote shadow could dominate even a continent-sized island. Who knows, maybe this is even a blind, indicating something about the size of one of the islands. The symbol is extended in the second half of the statement, and whose summit touched the sphere of ether. Ether, especially when spelled with an A-E, is an inner and causal dimension, causal, that is, to the outer physical manifestation. Therefore, these fantastic measurements suggest that Mount Atlas, as the axis mundi of Atlantis, was considered to be a link between the outer manifestation of Atlantis and its noumenal source. And, MPH in his other writing took great pains to describe that source, beginning with Poseidon as a kind of logoic figure. MPH's wording, quote, touch the sphere of ether, strengthens this idea of Atlas as a linking agency. Any thoughts or questions so far on this? Next, This is the axle mountain of the world, sacred among many races and symbolic of the human head, which rises out of the four elements of the body. So MPH's use of the term human head might suggest that Mount Atlas was considered to be the head center of Atlantis, which rises beyond the influence of air, fire, water, and earth, the four primary elements, and, quote, touch the sphere of the fifth unifying element, ether. Ultimately, the head center of a race is a means of demonstrating the purpose as determined by the Manu of that race. Thus, Atlantis, we might hypothesize, was the personification of the Atlantean Manu. It's easy to see how the memory and vibratory influence of such a mountain would be transferred by the guardians of this knowledge to the central mountain of the fifth root race, such as Olympus and very definitely Meru. In the same way, and for the same reasons, that the potency of the Atlantean city of the Golden Gates was transferred, at least symbolically, to the many and varied holy cities of the new root race, all, of course, patterned on and emblematic of Shambhala. So any thoughts or questions on anything in this paragraph? Okay. Next up. Can we get a reader, please? We'll take two little
Yes.
paragraphs at once.
Andrea, can you read that for us, please?
The history of Atlantis, writes Ignatius Donnelly, is the key of the Greek mythology. There can be no question that these gods of Greece were human beings. The tendency to attach divine attributes to great earthly rulers is one deeply implanted in human nature. See Atlantis. The same author sustains his views by noting that the deities of the Greek pantheon were not looked upon as creators of the universe, but rather as regents set over it by its more ancient original fabricators. The Garden of Eden, from which humanity was driven by a flaming sword, is perhaps an allusion to the earthly paradise supposedly located west of the Pillars of Hercules and destroyed by volcanic cataclysms. The deluge legend may be traced also to the Atlantean inundation, during which a world was destroyed by water.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts or questions about this short paragraph? Anybody disagree with any of the ideas put forth here? Okay. Here's the full quote from Donnelly, referred to here, right? The beginning of this paragraph. Could we get a reader for this, please?
Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
Another proof that the gods of the Greeks were but deified kings of Atlantis is found in the fact that the gods were not looked upon as having created the world. They succeeded to the management of a world already in existence. The gods dwelt on Olympus. They lived together like human beings. They possessed palaces, storehouses, stables, horses, etc. They dwelt in a social state which was but a magnified reflection of the social system on Earth. Quarrels, love passages, mutual assistance, and such instances as characterize human life were ascribed to them. Murray's Mythology, page 10. Where was Olympus? It was in Atlantis. It was in Atlantis. The ocean encircled the earth with a great stream and was a region of wonders of all kinds, Ibid. It was a great island, the then civilized world. The encircling ocean was spoken of in all the ancient legends. Okeanos lived there with his wife, Tethys. These were the islands of the blessed. the garden of the gods, the sources of the nectar and ambrosia on which the gods lived.
Thank you, Carrie. So, any thoughts come up based on this reading? Obviously, Donnelly based his ideas on the exoteric stories of the Greek gods, which is understandable since these are the only teachings that have survived from Greece. But there were certainly other stories with more profound interpretations taught in the mystery schools. With the exception of a few great scholars like Joe Campbell and Thomas Taylor, academic mythology seems to be satisfied with assuming that the religion of the ancients in general, and the Greeks in particular, was devoid of any profound philosophy. In spite of the fact that MPH quoted this passage, he knew that the Greek gods were personifications of cosmic forces, as evidenced by his interpretation of the Orphic key that we looked at during the last webinar. It is heroes that are often created from historical personages, not gods, except exoterically. Donnelly makes the same exoteric misinterpretation, in my humble opinion, of the Garden of Eden, the true version of which initiated the entire evolutional arc of human development, rather than being a, quote, place west of the Pillars of Hercules. This is the most exoteric understanding possible. Any thoughts about this?
Yes. Efrosini says, I think that we have an idealized presentation of Atlantis. There were many negative elements, very intense black magic, which eventually led to its early destruction.
Absolutely, no question. And we looked at that at some length. Tevatat, the great, not great, but that overshadowing demonic entity, which, because of the lack of mental development in any individualization at all, was able to sweep through the consciousness of so many of the Atlanteans. In fact, the vast majority. And as a result, they had to be destroyed in a sense for their own good, because, just losing the physical body is a small price to pay compared to, plunging deeper into the black forms. And since from a certain point of view, there were innocent victims because of their lack of development, it had to be stopped. So yeah, there's no question of that. But there was a white brotherhood, the followers of the one truth, it was called, that emerged from there, and that was what seeded, SEED, seeded all of the surrounding areas, especially the Quetzalcoatl, Egyptian, Chaldean, and Hindu. Those are sort of the primary holders of the light from the remnants of the old way, because for millions of years Atlantis developed exactly right on schedule, is exactly as it was supposed to. We tend to think of Atlantis in terms of its last few thousand years, but you have to remember it existed for millions and millions of years, developing as it was supposed to, the integration of the astral body, to develop that, to erase the cleavage between the physical and the astral body, right? The purpose was to become astrally polarized. Unfortunately, because it ended in the fourth root race, that wasn't completed, and we're now doing that work, as we'll discover in later reading. But yeah, so thank you for bringing that to our awareness. this does tend to, this part does tend to focus on the positive aspect, the earthly paradise idea, Okay, any other thoughts?
Yes, Yvonne's got her hand up. Go ahead. Oops.
This part about the Garden of Eden, I would have thought that the Garden of Eden occurred in the Lemuria race, the one before Atlantis, during individualization.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. It's basically, with the division, there's a lot of implication about the division of the sexes, the idea of the rib of Adam, right? HPB talks about this a lot. And so that would have been in the fourth root race of the Lemurian race that you would have had that. So when I said the beginning of the evolutionary arc, I meant of that, part of the development. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I agree with you. Anyone else? Yeah, this has all been a pretty exoteric reading in my opinion. Okay. On the other hand, go ahead.
Sorry, Andrea had her hand up, but then okay.
Okay, it's if that happens, I don't need to know about it. It's only if it stays up.
It stayed up.
No, sorry. It's just to clarify. So in the Atlantean, at this point in the Atlantean fourth root race, there was still a lack of individualization within a great many of the populace that enabled that dark energy to really control sort of
Right.
the universal response of that population.
Exactly. Individualization is seen now, wait a minute. This is not the individualization of moving from the animal to the human kingdom.
Right.
This is that individualization that's represented more by the Leo stage of becoming an individually aware consciousness, right?
Yes.
So,
okay.
and which is very much oriented towards mental polarization or mental understanding, at least development of the mental. That acts as a check against the dark forces because you can think for yourself. But if you're astrally polarized, well, hey, we saw it in the Second World War. What happens is this mass response, to the negative forces, to the dark forces, and we've even had it more recently in certain political arenas, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, that helps.
And
Thank
it
you.
takes, so it's development of the mental, ultimately resulting in mental polarity, which is in its final stage, the integrated personality that acts as a check against the dark forces, not as an absolute guarantee, but as a very strong check to being swept into that. Anyway.
Thanks.
Yeah. On the other hand, the quote, deluge legend is not a symbolic event and most certainly had its origins in humanity's collective memory of the destruction of Atlantis. Here's just one of the dozens of examples of flood mythologies derived from the Atlantean flood. Could we get a reader, please?
Yes, Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
Okay. It is a common legend among the American Aborigines that their progenitors came forth out of the openings in the earth, ascending from their subterranean abodes to escape a flood or deluge loosened by one of the gods of the underworld. In the Navajo account of the deluge, 7 deities were involved. The whole account may be a survival of the primitive agricultural mythos. This legend suggests that the Indians had originally inhabited the lowlands, but had fled to the mountains to escape the terrible tidal waves caused by the Atlantean disaster, which temporarily at least inundated great areas of the earth. Plato infers that the Atlantean deluge was loosed by the gods because of the sins of men. In the American Indian legends, the flood from which the red men escaped in various ways also was an act of retribution on the part of the great Manito spirit.
Okay. We're going to run into a lot of not politically correct titles, savages, red men, etc. You just have to bear with us. A lot of this is turn of the century, 19th to 20th century stuff. So it's just, rather than change this term to Native American, I just kept with his original. So, but it needs a point of recognition. And yet the flood that sank Atlantis was not the only, let alone the primordial flood, which took place at the end of the Satya Yuga, tens of millions of years before the flood that swept away Atlantis. There was also a flood that engulfed the third root race. In fact, the ancient wisdom teachings tells us that floods are not an uncommon means of initiating a pralaya between races, between subraces, and ages. Could we get a reading for this short, or maybe you could read it, Bial?
Okay. As, however, neither the Rig Veda nor Manu, both preceding, Vaivasvata's deluge,
Good.
that of the bulk of the fourth race, mention this deluge. It is evident that it is not the great deluge, nor that which carried away Atlantis, nor even the deluge of Noah, which is meant here. This churning relates to a period before the Earth's formation.
Thank you. Any thoughts about this? Okay.
We have a comment from Carrie. He says, what are the previous 4 Indian pictures?
Oh, I don't know. We can look at it. You can see that, for instance, it's taking this one, for example, that there's a flood emanating from the underworld here, which is surrounded by this particular deity. And then here's the outer world of Indian life. And so, yeah, but I don't, here are the 7 sources that he mentions here. What does he say here? Where's 7? Find it for me. 7 deities were involved, right, in this, in the Navajo deluge. So you see them here, 4 and 3, and their emblems. It'd be, it's a point of, that would be fascinating to go further into, but I haven't. If any of you have, I see Samuel maybe has a comment on this.
Okay, I just wanted to say that the top left one
Yeah.
reminds me of the schemes, you know what I'm talking about. The pictures of the planetary schemes and how they each have different formations of
But I don't think that's. I think that's too cosmic for these. I think again we're looking at the 7 deities responsible for the deluge. Because they're inside this realm of the underworld. This very much like here. There's so many septenaries that relate outward. But let's see what Samuel has to say.
Go ahead, Samuel.
Maybe it's okay. Let's go ahead then.
Sorry, can
Yeah,
you
go
hear me?
ahead. Yes,
I'm sorry.
no problem.
Okay, yeah, I think based on what HPB says in her writing that the deluge could not have been the one in which the Indian gods took part in, or the deluge of the Noah period. I'm thinking that it might be the one the Christian Bible referred to as in Genesis, where it says the earth. I mean, right at the beginning of creation, when the entire earth was kind of covered in water, and the spirit, according to the Genesis scripture, where God has to say the water has to give way to dry land, So
That's
that might
really,
be
that's a good reference. Yeah. I
that
like
might
that
be
idea that, we're in a sense in the beginning is, after some pralaya that was initiated by a flood. Let's go back to that picture there if I can. Let's go back here. Yeah, this one. Right. Yeah, this idea, this is a very primordial. This could be, for instance, equivalent to those first verses in Genesis, what you're looking at here, right? So yeah, I like that. That's a good thought. Anyone else? Any thoughts about this?
That it's Kerry. The last picture, now the previous one now.
Oh, wait a minute. Which one? This one?
Yes, this one. We have those same 7 men in the boat and the whale that we had quite a long time ago.
Yes, quite a long
You
time.
remember, it's
indeed.
exactly the same situation.
Isn't it? Yeah, isn't that interesting? Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, and if I don't know if you remember, there was a similar picture that we used for a while of the 7 and the 1. You can think of this as the sort of the breakout of the third logos. Who is a 7 and 1 being, and those are the ray energies ultimately. And I wouldn't be surprised that if not esoterically, in this tradition, we don't have the same energies involved, which is, hey, it's going to be that primordial, for our Earth, it would be the planetary logos and his agents in terms of the rays, the planes, and maybe even the Buddhas of activity were involved in this process, right? Of course, the Navajo legend, that's going to be a metaphorical representation. It's not going to be theosophical per se, but that doesn't mean it's not the same truth. Thanks for pointing that out. That's excellent. Okay. Yeah, you can even take it down into this. Isn't it? It's this interesting. Here's that evil influence that might have, we don't know, but that made the flood necessary in the first place. And the 4 points, the quaternary, the form aspect, which is always what this represents. So, anyone else? Yes.
Yvonne's got her hand up. Yvonne?
Even though, they say it's the retribution for the sins of the Atlanteans, but I read in a few places where this was just the regular pole shift. This was the time, when this happened. And that's what was really going on when the cycles were changing or the poles were changing.
Okay, well, that's a very exoteric view because, the Atlantean root race was interrupted at its 4th subrace. So those cycles that you mentioned are always effects of a source that is determined by the path that the current humanity is following. And at that point, it was an act of compassion. As I said before, destroying the physical vehicle is a small price to pay to avoid further immersion into an evil, I'll just say further immersion into evil in all different ways. So it stopped that particular wave of energy. Interestingly, I think it's mentioned in DK towards the end that there was only a couple of times that the hierarchy was put on high alert in terms of possible interference. For instance, they were during World War II and they didn't have to involve themselves. And another time was during this period in Atlantis. Okay, any other thoughts about this? All right, could we get a new reader, please? Move on to the next paragraph.
Lynn, can you read that for us, please?
Was the religious, philosophic, and scientific knowledge possessed by the priestcrafts of antiquity secured from Atlantis, whose submergence obliterated every vestige of its part in the drama of the world progress? Atlantean sun worship has been perpetuated in the ritualism and ceremonialism of both Christianity and Pagandom. Both the cross and the serpent were Atlantean emblems of divine wisdom. The divine Atlantean progenitors of the Mayans and Quiches of Central America coexisted within the green and azure radiance of the Gukumatz, the Plume serpent. The 6 skyborn sages came into manifestation as centers of light bound together or synthesized by the 7th and chief of their order, the feathered snake, Si Popol Vuh. The title of winged or plume snake was applied to Quetzalcoatl or Kulkakan, the Central American initiate. The center of the Atlantean wisdom religion was presumably a great pyramidal temple standing on the brow of a plateau rising in the midst of the city of the Golden Gates. From here, the initiate priests of the sacred feather went forth, carrying the keys of the universal wisdom to the uttermost parts of the earth.
Okay, thoughts or questions about this? This introduces a whole new topic connected with the migration of Atlanteans. And before we get into analyzing this paragraph, it's fascinating information. Let's take a look at what Edgar Cayce had to say about the migration from Atlantis to Central America, described in this paragraph. Cayce, for those of you not familiar with this extraordinary clairvoyant, was probably the most documented psychic of the 20th century. In total, he gave over 22,000 readings while in a trance state, over 14,000 of which were recorded. Cayce was unaware of the content of his reading as he was giving them, but eventually developed an interest in learning more about the subjects he was channeling and became, in a sense, a student of his own information, which includes healing, reincarnation, dreams, the afterlife, past life, nutrition, Atlantis, future events, etc. Among his clients were Woodrow Wilson, while president, Thomas Edison, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin. So he was quite a phenomenon, 20th century phenomenon. So can we get a reader for this, please? By the way, when Cayce says the entity, he means a past incarnation of the person to whom he is giving a reading. An ellipsis means Cayce's voice has dropped away or the recording was unintelligible. Okay, reader, please.
Joan, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. Not all of the Atlanteans came east to Europe and Africa. Many, according to the Cayce life readings, traveled west to the Americas. This is deduced from 2 readings given 5 years apart. Both refer to migrations westward to escape the final destruction of Atlantis. In the Atlantean land, during those periods, when there were the activities that brought about the last destruction through the warring of the sons of the Law of One and the sons of Belial, among those sent to what later became the Yucatan land of the Mayan experiences, May 28, 1938. In Atlantean land, when there were those periods of the last upheavals or the disappearance of the Isles of Poseidia, the entity was among those who went to what later became known as the Inca land, the Peruvian land as called in the present, December 31st, 1943. In the following excerpts are hints that some record of these migrations may be discovered. Some of the Atlanteans, when there was the breaking up of the land, came to what was called the Mayan land, or what is now Yucatan. The entity was the first to cross the water in the air machine of that period, April 12th, 1939. In the land now known as Yucatan, when there were establishments from Atlantean land, the entity was in temple as a recorder, during which time there were periods of dissension with those in authority, when there were the decisions of most of the people to join with the movement to what is now portions of Arizona. The entity chose to remain. Records may eventually be discovered again. June 3rd, 1944. In Atlantean land, during period of egress before final destruction, coordinated departure activities, journey to Central America, where some of the temples are being uncovered today, 1935, began practice of cremation. Ashes may be found in one of the temples prepared for same, May 1, 1935.
Thank you. And another reader, please.
Scott, can you read that for us, please?
Sounds like you're begging.
Yeah, I am.
On the destruction of Atlantis, quote, from time as counted in the present, we would turn back to 10,600 years before the Prince of Peace came into the land of promise, and find a civilization being disturbed by corruption from within to such measures that the elements joined in bringing devastation to a stiff-necked and adulterous people. With the second and third upheavals in Atlantis, there were individuals who left those lands and came to this particular portion then visible. But understand, the surface was quite different from that which would be viewed in the present. For rather than being a tropical area, it was more temperate and quite varied. Then with the leavings of the civilization in Atlantis, Iltar, with a group of followers that had been of the household of Atlan, followers of the worship of the One, with some 10 individuals left this land, Poseidonia, came westward, entering what would now be a portion of the Yucatan. And there began, with the activities of the peoples there, the development into a civilization that rose much in the same manner as that which had been in the Atlantean land. Some had left the land earlier, others left later. There had also been upheavals from the land of Mu or Lemuria, and these had their part in the changing. There was the injection of their tenants in the varied portions of the land, which was much greater in extent up until the final upheavals of Atlantis, when much of the contour of Central America and Mexico was changed and outlined similar to that which may be seen in the present. First temples that were erected by Iltar and his followers were destroyed at the period of change in the contours of the land. The ruins which are now being found was then a combination of those peoples from Mu, Oz, and Atlantis. November 12, 1933.
Thanks, Scott. It's fascinating stuff, isn't it? Any thoughts or questions about this? Get back there. Either of these readings. You know, there's, of course, go ahead.
The mention of Lemuria here puzzles me. I don't know is that accurate? Is that still in play at this point in time, or is that ancient history?
You mean this here where he says there had also been upheavals of land in Mu or Lemuria, and these had their part in the changing? Yeah, this is new to me too, because we don't think of there being an overlap between the third root race and the fourth, of them coexisting. But one way that might be explained is that it's the land of Lemuria, whereas the root race may have been have already ended and the land persisted. I'm just guessing, as to one way that might have been, that there might have been remnants of the land of Lemuria. But, HPB tells us that there was another flood that destroyed Lemuria before Atlantis came into being. So, it's...
Another thing that I'm curious about, and maybe you covered this previously, is the truly ancient continent of Atlantis, of which Poseidonus was simply a remnant island.
Right.
Or Cerberus. Did that not cover most of North America as well? And South America, was it not quite large? And so when you're talking of Arizona.
Well, there was a migration to Arizona here, he's suggesting. Right.
This was already up and happening.
Yeah.
Continent. And it went down and came back up? We don't know.
We don't know. Everything I've read from all the sources suggests that everyone who was to carry the seed of the, let's see, how does he describe it here? The sons of the law of one. It's interesting because this is a very popular new agey thing, the law of one, by the way. Probably was derived from these readings, who knows. But anyway, that everyone who's carrying the great white brotherhood forward to the into the fifth Aryan race had to do so literally by leaving Atlantis and going to these new areas. And of course, it's not mentioned about like the lowlands of the American South. This is just not. I've never seen it mentioned, so that just remains a question mark. DK says that part of America was Atlantis. He just says that outright at some point. So, but it's not, there's no corroboration between that and how the flood worked that I've come across. So, yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, we've got a couple of comments here. First, Carrie says Scott's audio is too soft.
Okay.
And he says always. So turn your volume up a tad, Scott, please. And then Yvonne says, what's Oz in the next slide? It talks about...
Everybody knows what Oz is. Right? There's witches and I don't know. Let's see, it's right here, isn't it? Of Mu or Lemuria. Where is that? Oz.
Down at the bottom.
Oh yeah, here we are. Mu, Oz, and Atlantis. I don't know. I've never heard it mentioned, the land of Oz, for instance, in the HPB, where you get so much. I see hands going up. Maybe everybody knows this. I know the only citizen I know was Dorothy, and Toto, and a sort of pretend wizard. But other than that, I don't know much about it. Anybody know?
One of the panelists has her hand up, and then Trudy's had her hand up for a little bit, but let's go to, who is it? Oh, Joe. Joe, do you know the answer to that question?
Well, I've heard speculation, Australia, there's all kinds of correlations using Oz with the Aboriginal Australian people. And I had another thought when we were talking, the question of Lemuria and these land masses. This may be alluding to something that's been speculated about the separation of the land mass into the continents. And, when you look at different pictures of that, there's the way that they're configured, you could see where there would have been some orientation of the land of Oz with the land of, they're talking about here, the land mass.
Yeah,
that-
I seem to remember association with Australia as well, with Oz, but it's a vague memories. I can't verify that for sure. But yeah, does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Any other info on Oz? Trudy?
Yeah, Trudy's had her hand up for a little bit before we got into that question. So let's go to her, and then if anybody has any
Thoughts about it? Yeah.
yeah, okay. Trudy.
You might pop something in the chat box, and then BL will know that you know, and we'll call on you.
No, I haven't got any clues about Oz. I wanted to know about the Prince of Peace. Does that mean Jesus, or
Where does that occur? Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right in the top?
He was a devout Christian. Edgar Casey was, but he usually uses him as a time reference, like 10,000 years before the Prince of Peace. Yes, that's exactly who he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, this is all through, after all, this comes through his personality aspect. So you have, for instance, I thought this was an interesting comment, and bringing devastation to a stiff-necked and adulterous people. Now, that sounds like a early 20th century Christians, evaluation, of what he's seeing in his mind's eye, right? And somebody else might have another way of describing it, but so it's through the filter of his personality that these visions came. Yes, anybody?
Okay.
So it's not like the ancient wisdoms coming to us from a master of wisdom, but I think my personal opinion, and you have to have your own about this, is that it's limited, but it's a unique source and should at least be considered. That's why I'm, not to mention that there's absolutely nothing else that describes this particular aspect, of the migration of Atlantis. Go ahead, whoever.
Okay, we have a bunch, we got a couple more hands, but we've got a bunch of comments that came in first. So Efrosini says, somehow we are not all or are we not all refugees from the destruction of Atlantis? Don't we all hide in Atlantean nature, the emotional one within us?
Well, it's two questions. First of all, literally coming from Atlantis, a huge number of us did. Edgar Casey at some point says that over half of the people that he did readings for, something came forth that indicated that they had had a life in Atlantis. And that doesn't mean that the other half or any part of that other half hadn't. It's just that half of the readings, that literally came up. So that in itself, out of 22,000 readings, shows, what a huge influence these past lives had. As to the other part of the question, which is the stage that DK calls Atlantean consciousness, that everyone goes through. There's absolutely, so you're right from that point of view. There's the literally having been a citizen of Atlantis or not, and then there's the have we gone through the stage of Atlantean consciousness, which is being emotionally polarized, and to that, yes, everyone passes. So yeah, good observation on that. Anyone else?
And then, bunches. And then Carrie says, the law of one is of Egyptian origin through an entity called Ra. So he doesn't think it was a steal from Casey.
Well, okay. Yeah. That makes much more sense, and of course, then you have to, if you look at Casey's recognition that this law of one came from Atlantis, then, since Egypt was one of the primary transfers, then you can imagine that ultimately the law of one did come from Atlantis. And Casey's just citing this. But yeah, thanks for that reference, Carrie.
And then a couple of people, Joan and Scott, said Oz is used as a reference to Australia in contemporary culture. And Scott says the Australians are commonly call their land Oz, and their Aborigines have been marked as Lemurian remnants.
Right.
So,
yeah, I'm thinking that's correct. Just to make things even more complicated, does anybody have any thoughts about mu? Because I think that's correct in terms of the Aboriginal, which, Australia was primarily Aboriginal. I think that's correct, that was Oz. Does anybody know anything about mu while we're at it?
Carrie says Mu is Lemuria. And then Joan has had her hand up for a while. She also typed a question about the physical aspect of all this. But Joan, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Okay, yeah, this is on the physical. So it's often been a question in my mind, sort of highlighted last night by seeing a PBS show on evolution. Nothing new particularly in it, but it highlights the time frame involved for evolution of the animal form and the timing and how that changes. And, and then it didn't go into, but, migration of Indians from Asia, and I think it's the Hopi, might be Tibet, actually. How do you reconcile all of that with what contemporary scientists are saying?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, I know, and I don't want to divert it too much.
It's okay. I mean, these questions should be asked, right? The short answer would be read The Secret Doctrine, especially Volume 2, because HPB deals with this a lot, about reconciling. She's obsessed with reconciling science and The Secret Doctrine. But I can give you a few things, which is that current science, I think Lucy is one of the.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not up to date on the latest in anthropological discoveries, but I know that they've been able to push it back to a few million years for a kind of pre-human state, before the Neanderthal remains, right? And all of that is much, much more recent than these earlier root races. For instance, even the earliest establishment of Atlantis, and quite simply that root race, in terms of remains, did not survive the archaeological record. And this is a huge discussion. We looked at it a little bit in the first couple of sessions on Atlantis, about where it might have been, and the scientific theories. There's even been serious papers. It's not done anymore, but there, turn of the last century, there was serious scientific discussions about where it might have been, and how remains might have been discovered. But their science at this point completely discards it as any possibility. So from that side, there's no effort made at all to reconcile, so any reconciliation has to come from the other side, and you just have to look at the extraordinary antiquity of these root races, and the fact that they were completely developed and then completely erased from the archaeological record before any version of modern anthropology came along. Now, if somebody has, something more to contribute to that, I would appreciate it. I'm on the fringes of my own knowledge in this area.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, just two little comments. Yeah, I mean, they talk about the destructions, the five, which could relate to some of these big floods that we're talking about, one in particular. But then the other oddity for me, and this is, I won't go any further in this, is that, the screen that we have up and one other talks about the destruction of Atlantis is only 10,600 years ago, which is really very recent. I mean, that's just when the end of the Ice Age was happening. So, it's sort of like
What's up with that?
years is almost
12,000.
easier to understand than this recent thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's more like 12,000. But at any rate, your point is taken.
Yeah, sorry.
First of all, it's the last remnants. It's the last island, Poseidia, I think they called it.
Okay.
Most of Atlantis was, first of all, Atlantis didn't fall overnight. Most of Atlantis, the history of Atlantis took place over the millions of years that preceded that. That was literally the last remnant.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to deviate too much, but it is.
No, it's not a deviation. It's not a deviation. It really didn't please everyone. Any questions you have at all is going to take us, further into the subject. It's all very interesting, and that is one of the primary questions. And there's not a quick answer, to that idea of reconciling science and theosophy or the ancient wisdom teachings, except for in terms of the enormous time frames, right? Beyond that, it's difficult to do without being a visionary yourself. Like, it'd be great to have asked Casey some of these questions, because he would have just been able to pull it forward. I don't know that was ever done. Okay, anyone else? Looks like
yes, lots more comments, and several hands went up and down, and they typed the comments. So anyway, Andrea says, L. Frank Baum, who was the author of The Wizard of Oz, was a member of the Theosophical Society.
Hey, that's great to know. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
And Carrie says Mu is Lemuria, and then Efrosini goes on to say, from Wikipedia, Mu is a legendary lost continent. The term was introduced by Augustus let's just call him Augustus, who used the land of Mu as an alternative name for Atlantis. It was subsequently popularized as an alternative term for the hypothetical land of Lemuria by James Churchwood, who asserted that Mu was located in the Pacific Ocean before its destruction.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to do a search in all the literature that I have about Mu to get an esoteric reference to that. Like starting with HPB and then just looking through everything to see. But my memory is that it's connected with Lemuria. So we'll have to leave it at that for now.
And then Samuel says, Oz is also a unit of measurement, and therefore to use it in this context would perhaps be to give it a sense of an ideal place, which somehow has all the best conditions in order for an occasion to take place there.
Yeah, I like that. There's something of the alpha omega quality to the name itself. It's sort of like the beginning and end, because the O is zero, suggests a beginning. I mean, that's just an idea. So yeah, I like that. Anyone else?
Yvonne says Easter Island is a remnant of Lemuria.
Correct. That's our understanding, and that the statues there are evidently likenesses of these giant Lemurians. And we're going to actually get into a little segment on giants here in this segment on Atlantis. And they certainly are references to that. Those statues are references to that race of giants. Anyone else?
Yeah. Joan says there is a series of books about Mu. Interestingly, at least one of these books was in Ataturk's library in Turkey with his annotations.
Was what in Turkey?
It was in Ataturk's library
Oh,
in Turkey, and he annotated it, apparently.
oh, okay.
And then
Well,
Carrie,
for those of you who want to read several books about Mu, there's your reference.
Carrie says A.E. Powell in his The Solar System quotes Mu as part of, and it's missing. What's the rest of that? Carrie?
Lemuria.
Oh, it's part of Lemuria. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same as
that's
you
been
already
my-
said.
Right. Okay, you guys are great. You just jump on this stuff. That's terrific. I appreciate it. I don't have the, I can't work behind the scenes like you can, so I appreciate it. When you do on-the-spot research like this, it brings a lot to this process. So good for you. Okay, any other thoughts or questions?
Okay, Joan, you're going to have to explain this. You said comment about the Wizard of Oz. Was that, you mean the Wizard of Oz was what was in Ataturk's library?
No, that the whole Mu thing was. No, but the Wizard of Oz, TS used to have an article about the connection of Wizard of Oz to Theosophical Ageless wisdom.
Huh,
So the yellow brick road is the path in life, and the three characters along the way, the brain,
right.
the heart, and
the
wisdom
lion,
and courage were
right.
the three aspects, and many aspects. It was sort of like written into the story. These,
it's transparently true, isn't it?
yes,
when you think about it, it's not hard at all to unravel some aspects of it. So yeah, thanks for making that note. Everybody rent it and read it with this in mind. Do a theosophical interpretation and
forget the flying monkeys for a moment.
Okay, anyone else?
I think we got them all.
How about that? Great, love it. All right, back to the text. To answer the question, right? All this was part of, anyway. To answer the question, was the religious, philosophical, and scientific knowledge possessed by the priestcraft of antiquity secured from Atlantis, whose submergence obliterated every vestige of its part in the drama of world progress? To answer that question, we'll turn to the introduction of Secret Doctrine, Volume 1, which gives us information on the ultimate source of philosophic and scientific knowledge. So could we get a reader, please?
Okay, I'm going to ask Anne Veronica to read it, but first I have to read her comment. She says, why forget them? The thoughts are the flying monkeys.
Okay.
That's pretty darn good. That is pretty darn good.
That's right. That's right. Monkey mind. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
The very old book. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're great.
The very old book is the original work from which the many volumes of QT were compiled. Not only this letter and the Sephirah, I can't read that,
Sephra Zeniuta.
Zeniuta, but ever the Sefer Zezirah, the work attributed by the Hebrew Kabbalists to the patriarch Abraham, the book of Shu King, China's primitive Bible, the sacred volume of the Egyptian Thoth Hermes, the Puranas in India, and the Chaldean book of Numbers, and the Pentateuch, that means 5, itself, are all derived
from that one small parent volume.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt here. The Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. What she's saying here is that all of these sources and come from this very old volume, right? That pre-exists everything. And then she's dissing the Kabbalists for saying that it comes from their patriarch Abraham. So go ahead.
Okay, tradition says that it was taken down in Senzar, the sacerdotal tongue, from the word of the divine being who dictated it to the sons of light in Central Asia at the very beginning of the 5th hour race. For there was a time when its language, the Senzar, was known to the initiates of every nation, when the forefathers of the Toltec understood it as easily as the inhabitants of the lost Atlantis, who inherited it in their turn from the sages of the third race, the Manushis, who learned it direct from the Devas of the second and first races.
So as you can see, it goes all the way back, and probably was even held in Pralaya from one globe to the next, because it is the true source of the ancient wisdom. Okay, next up, Atlantean sun worship has been perpetuated in the ritualism and ceremonialism of both Christianity and Pagandom. Well, there's no denying this. For example, every one of the 8 mystery schools we've studied so far have recognized the sun as the spiritual center of their belief. Belenus, Udin, Mithras, Orpheus, Serapis, and the Gnostic Christ are all solar deities. But it is the Egyptians, one of the direct inheritors of the Atlantean ageless wisdom, that excelled in their recognition of the sun as God. Could we get a reader for the short passage?
Okay, but first I want to read what Efrosini says. She says, do we have information about the language or languages spoken in Atlantis?
Not to my knowledge. I haven't run across anything. I'm gonna fix this. No, not to my knowledge. Oh no, it's fine. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Karen, can you read that for us, please?
Was the object of their highest adoration. He is the father of the god of the sun, the ruler of the region of light. Ra was the sun god. He was the supreme deity at On in Heliopus, near Memphis. His symbol was the solar disk supported by 2 rings. He created all that exists below the heavens.
Okay. So next up, it's just an example of the survival of sun worship from Atlantis. Okay. Next, both the cross and the serpent were Atlantean emblems of divine wisdom, and both resurfaced in many religions. Here we have the Egyptian winged serpent Wadjet, protector and patron of all Egypt. Can we get a reader for this?
Okay. Before we do, though, Anne Veronica says Heliopolis is the city of the sun, is a Greek word.
Yes. And so, the original Egyptian would be a altogether different wording, but it's commonly called Heliopolis. Yeah.
Okay. The occult traditions tell that in an ancient age, there were winged serpents upon the earth. The rulers of Atlantis were known as the Serpent Kings, and the winged serpent was their totem. According to the old traditions, the serpent originally walked upright, but because of his pride and sin, he fell. The fallen serpents may well have been the famous Atlantean sorcerer kings described in the Oriental secret lore.
Okay, so you can see that the direct connection going on here. You know, it's just, there's just so much metaphor in this symbol alone, right? Serpent is ever the phohatic principle of that which connects the form and the spirit aspect, and you have here the solar deity and the phohatic impulse, and then the wings ever represent spirit and the evolutionary path. There's so much that can be read into this. It's a wonderful symbol. And of course, serpents walking upright is a tongue-in-cheek. Serpents are always great masters of wisdoms, right? So when you know that saying, to walk the path, you must become the path. Well, to become, to gain the wisdom of the secret teachings, you must become that wisdom, and that wisdom is represented by a serpent. So this is a symbol of some great master. Okay, let's see, where am I? All right. So let's take a look at an excerpt from the Quiche creation myth found in the Popol Vuh, which is referenced here, which features the feathered serpent as creator. Okay. Could we get a reader, please?
Joe, can you read that for us, please?
Sure. In the Quiche myth of the beginning, the heaven was formed and all the signs thereof set in their angle and alignment, and its boundaries fixed towards the four winds by the creator and former, the mother and father of life and existence. The face of the earth had not yet appeared, only the peaceful sea and all the space of heaven. There was nothing yet joined together, nothing that clung to anything else, nothing that balanced itself, that made the least rustling, that made a sound in the heaven. There was nothing that stood up, nothing but the quiet water, but the sea calm and alone in its boundaries. Nothing existed, nothing but immobility and silence in the darkness, in the night. Alone also the creator, the former, the dominator, the feathered serpent, those that engender, those that give being. They are upon the water like a growing light. They are enveloped in green and blue, and therefore their name is Gukumats. Lo now how the heavens exist, how exists also the heart of heaven. And they spake, they consulted together and meditated. They mingled their words and their opinion.
Thank you, Joe. I find this very moving. We could spend the rest of the webinar just, pulling this one apart. It's just full of fabulous metaphors, and also, so much that appears in other, wisdom source material. It's just wonderful stuff. Gukumats, right? Described here, right here, Gukumats. The plumed serpent had his priestly representative in Quetzalcoatl. Could we get a reader for this section?
Okay, but first I want to read what Anne Veronica said. Her question was, she says, a dragon is in one sense a serpent that flies. Am I thinking that right?
Yes, they're really interchangeable ideas. A dragon of wisdom, and, the serpent represents knowledge. There's specific uses for both. For instance, a dragon is sometimes used to represent the the logos of the watery period, and we'll be taking a look at it. That's called the sun of water, and the dragon was the symbol of that period. But more generally speaking, they're in many ways interchangeable. Also, there's an association with a crocodile and with Capricorn in terms of dragon. So yeah, there's many much interconnectedness there, and they also have their specific meanings.
Okay, Carrie, can you read that for us, please?
The leader and civilizer of the Nahua family was Quetzalcoatl. This is the legend respecting him. From the distant east, from the fabulous Huehue Tlapalan, this mysterious person came to Tula and became the patron god and high priest of the ancestors of the Toltecs. He is described as having been a white man with strong formation of body, broad forehead, large eyes, and a flowing beard. He wore a mitre on his head and was dressed in a long white robe reaching to his feet and covered with red crosses. In his hand he held a sickle. His habits were ascetic. He never married, was most chaste and pure in life, and is said to have endured penance in a neighboring mountain, not for its effects upon himself, but as a warning to others. He condemned sacrifices, except of fruits and flowers, and was known as the god of peace. For when addressed on the subject of war, he is reported to have stopped his ears with his fingers. He was skilled in many arts. He invented gem cutting and metal casting. He originated letters, and he invented the Mexican calendar. He finally returned to the land in the east from which he came, leaving the American coast of Veracruz. He embarked in a canoe made of serpent skins and sailed away into the east.
Wonderful. Okay, this illustration of a Mexican vase features the bearded Quetzalcoatl accompanied Donnelly's text. It was on the same page. Here are 3 additional depictions of the great avatar, Quetzalcoatl. So why is Quetzalcoatl associated with the plumed serpent? As you see there in the center. For that, we'll turn to HBB and get some. This will also answer your question about serpents and dragons a little bit, maybe. Can we get a reader, please?
Scott, can you read that for us, please?
We find A, the priests assuming the names of the gods they served. B, a little bit.
You're fading out, buddy.
I know, I just turning on my volume. B, the dragons held throughout all antiquity as the symbols of immortality and wisdom, of secret knowledge and of eternity. And C, the hierophants of Egypt, of Babylon and India, styling themselves generally the sons of the dragon and serpents. Thus the teachings of the secret doctrine are thereby corroborated. There were numerous catacombs in Egypt and Chaldea, some of them of a very vast extent. The most renowned of them were the subterranean crypts of Thebes and Memphis. Former, beginning on the western side of the Nile, extended towards the Libyan desert and were known as the Serpent's catacombs or passages. It was there that were performed the sacred mysteries of the Kuklos Anakis, the unavoidable cycle, more generally known as the circle of necessity, the inexorable doom imposed upon every soul after the bodily death, and when it has been judged in the Aminthian region. In de Bourgour's book, Wotan, the Mexican demigod, in narrating his expedition, describes a subterranean passage which ran underground and terminated at the root of the heavens, adding that this passage was a snake's hole. Una guerra e de columbra, and that he was admitted to it because he was himself a son of the snakes, or a serpent.
Okay, before we go on with this quote, any thoughts or questions about that? You can see the association here, sons of the dragon and serpents. So you see the association between the two. I absolutely adore this sculpture. He is literally his head is poking out the jaws of this great serpent. That's just amazing to me. So he is one with serpent energy, you could say. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So the quote goes on.
All
and
right.
you have another picture of Quetzalcoatl here.
Okay, we have a comment from Efrosini. She says, I wonder how wisdom and knowledge and symbols of symbolization are transferred from one race to another. Is it through the consciousness of the initiates? Is it through books or means that are not destroyed? What is the Ark of the Covenant, symbolically speaking? Can we talk about astral permanent Adam, or of the whole humanity who maintained the wisdom of the Atlanteans?
Well, first of all, it's held by the hierarchy, right? And then it's re-emerges through those who have continuity of consciousness in the form of great masters that initiate the new version of the ancient wisdom, right? So there's never any danger of losing the thread, because it's permanent and held, beyond the quote archaeological record, unquote, altogether. So it doesn't depend on the survival of a book or of it being orally passed, because it survives in the hierarchy itself. Okay, let's yeah, go ahead. Anybody else?
No, do you need a new reader?
Yeah, a new reader for this quote, please.
Okay.
This is a continuation of that same quote.
All right, Lynn, can you do that? But hold on, Samuel just typed something, so let me read what he says, and then Lynn, if you can read that.
Are you looking for that?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was reading it, but I guess I was on mute. Hermes, who is the wisest of the Western sages, once referred to the serpent as being the most spiritual of the animals. But my other point is HPB mentioned in her writings that there were gigantic mammals, including so many strange creatures which walked the earth in days long ago, that our present-day anthropologists would be too dumbfounded if they could catch a glimpse of some of them.
They certainly would. Yeah. One of the reasons for the metaphor of the serpent is the fact that it sheds its skins. That's just one, which represents cyclic time, right? But there's also many others. The way it moves is like electrical movement, at least as far as all the animals are concerned. It moves more like an electrical wave than any other animal. And of course, there's hidden meanings altogether, probably literally connect the, like for instance, the Davic beings who overshadow the serpent kingdom, gosh knows what, all the associations available, I like this one. This is extraterrestrial buffs really love this sculpture because it looks like, Quetzalcoatl is there in his spacesuit and he's looking at at his screen, and and this represents his spaceship. So it's not the perspective I take, but it's interesting. So could we get a reader for this?
Lynn?
And also that drawing or that sculpture reminds me of being inside of the snake as
That's
though
it.
going to be born.
Yeah, look at this. It's another form of this
Exactly.
being inside. Yeah, indeed.
Francis, where is that previous picture? What was the source of that? Was that
I don't know.
or someplace? Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. I look for the provenance, but sometimes they're really lazy often about giving that to you. There's a great resource called Tineye, Tineye, and you can copy a picture and then literally paste it in that web, and you'll get other examples of this picture, and often they'll give you the source. I just may not have done it with this one, so you can often find that. But do a web search for Quetzalcoatl. This will come up certainly, and then do what I just suggested. That's Tineye, Tineye.com. It's a fabulous. There are other services that do the same thing. It's basically a search for pictures. You can get information about pictures and etc. Anyway, yes, go ahead.
Thank you. This is indeed very suggestive, for his description of the snake's hole is that of the ancient Egyptian crypt, as above mentioned. The Hierophants, moreover, of Egypt as of Babylon, generally styled themselves the sons of the serpent god, or sons of the dragon, during the mysteries. The Assyrian priests bore always the name of his god, says Movers. The Druids of the Celto-Britannic regions also called themselves snakes. I am a serpent, I am a druid, they exclaimed. The Egyptian king Karnak is twin brother to the Karnak of Britannia, the latter Karnak meaning the serpent's mount. The Dracontia once covered the surface of the globe, and these temples were sacred to the dragon, only because it was the symbol of the sun, which in its turn was the symbol of the highest god, the Phoenician Elon or Elion, whom Abraham recognized as El Elyon. Besides the surname of serpents, they were called the builders, the architects, for the immense grandeur of their temples and monuments were such that even now the pulverized remains of them frighten the mathematical calculations of our modern engineers, says Taliesin. Der Burgberg hints that the chiefs of the name of Wotan, the Quetzalcoatl, or serpent deity of the Mexicans, are the descendants of Ham and Canaan. I am Hiven, they say. Being a Hiven, I am of the great race of the dragon snake. I am a snake myself, for I am a Hivim. This reminds me also of the serpent mounds to be found in, where is it, Ohio? Somewhere in the Midwest like that.
Yeah, I actually have a picture coming up of that.
Ohio.
Of that. Yeah, is it Ohio? Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks. So, who was it that originally asked about serpents and dragons? Here you get a lot more information about that, and you can see how interchangeable they are, right? Just great stuff, isn't it?
We have
Okay, hang on a sec. This idea that Dracontia, which means worship of the dragon, you could say, once covered the surface of the globe, meaning that you can find these temples sacred to the dragon everywhere if you go back far enough, right? Because they are recognized. And the source of this, what he says here, is that it represents the sun. It's the highest God, the divine dragon of wisdom. Remember, behold, Oya-Ohu the younger, the divine dragon of wisdom, the refulgent glory. It's just amazing material. So there's the great source. And of course, behind that source is the central spiritual sun, which is the true dragon, right? So, and yet there's something, there's something that they're going to tell you. It's some initiation about this that we don't know, something about this great metaphor that we don't know.
Okay, we have a couple of comments here. And Veronica says, snake hole. It looks like the black and white holes of the universe.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's just, that's become a metaphor for passage from one level of reality to another. So, and that, of course, is what the snake hole represents too. I mean, it's not that different than the wormholes that are often talked about either, where you are able to traverse space beyond the speed of light, right? So it's interesting.
She also says that whenever you see L, at least in Greek, it means the bearer of light. And that's where we are called Hellas, born of light.
Thank you for that. That's great. I know it's a term of great reverence in some cultures. So that's great.
And then Scott says this sculpture is found outside Merida, Mexico at La Venta Park, which also has most of the great Olmec heads displayed there.
Oh, that's good to know. Wow. It's truly incredible, isn't it? And
Samuel has his hand up, so go ahead, Samuel. Did you have a question, Samuel?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, you have 10 minutes.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was just some observation that I made recently. I was fortunate to travel to El Salvador recently. I was there for like a week. And the name mentioned here, El, which start with the name of that country.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny that I started to think based on how almost like the national temperament in the entire country, how the people behave, just very kind, meek set of people, very friendly. And I started to think, well, is that the name that's kind of impacting them? And then in my hotel room, I have this very small South American painting of an elderly lady sitting down with a young girl and a basket full of fresh fruits. And then the young girl has a baby doll in her lap, just very humble picture. And that kind of depict the behavior of the people. Everybody you meet in El Salvador will give you a smile,
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, it's like being close to the sacred source of nature, it sounds like.
Isn't it?
Yeah, I'm aware of that a lot in Central American art, that there's a real awareness of that connection. Thank you, Samuel. Anyone else?
Vivian says in the sculpture, he is carrying a little suitcase, similar to those ones of the Assyrians, the winged beings. Also, the Egyptian lifting hands to the sun's rays carries 2 files. I wonder what these are.
Well, it could be an offering. It's really hard to say. The best way to determine that is to find other examples and see if you can get any more information based on other examples, which I haven't done, of course. Also the video screen is pretty unusual too. Anyone else? Okay, onward. Let's see. The most dramatic connection between the Mayan and Egyptian cultures is their use of the pyramid, which MPH suggests has a common origin in Atlantis. Edgar Casey tells us that an as yet undiscovered Egyptian pyramid still houses records from and the history of Atlantis. He also tells us that the Great Pyramid was constructed between, you ready for this? Get out your notebooks, 10,490 and 10,390 BC, just a century after the time of the final submergence of Atlantis. Okay, next up, can we get a reader?
Oops, Yvonne, can you read that for us, please?
The mythologies of many nations contain accounts of gods who came out of the sea. Certain shamans among the American Indians tell of holy men dressed in birds' feathers and wampum, who rose out of the blue waters and instructed them in the arts and crafts. Among the legends of the Chaldeans is that of Oannes, a partly amphibious creature who came out of the sea and taught the savage peoples along the shore to read and write, till the soil, cultivate the herbs for healing, study the stars, establish rational forms of government, and become conversant with the sacred mysteries. The Mayas, Quetzalcoatl, the savior god, whom Christian scholars believe to have been St. Thomas, from the waters, and after instructing the people in the essentials of civilization, rode out to sea on a magic raft to escape the wrath of the fierce god of the fiery mirror, Tesla Lepoka.
Tetzcatlipoca. Thank you. Any thoughts or questions about this paragraph? Okay, there are two levels of interpreting the concept of a god coming out of the sea. The first, and obvious, relates to those shamans who traveled by sea from Atlantis to all the lands surrounding their land of origin. The other level has to do with understanding water as the prima materia, the womb of existence. In the Chaldean mythology, it was Oannes, the manfish, who emerged into outer existence from these primordial waters in order to personify the power of the mystery name, Ioannes, or Oannes, from which came the name Dagon, Jonah, and John, among others. The Arctic Circle dwelling Inuit tribe has a number of sea gods and goddesses such as Sedna, who possibly represented an Oannes-like personification of the archetypal human. Like the Hindu Vishnu, Ioia personifies the entire microcosm. Could we get a reader for this, please?
Okay, I'm going to ask Joan to read it, but first I wanted to say Anne Veronica says Greece also has pyramids. There is one just out of the city of Argos.
Oh, okay, great.
And
I did not know that.
Vivian says a very large pyramid has been discovered in Visakoa, Bosnia. It has been dated as 28,000 years old.
Wow.
So,
that's something. Now, that should turn current archaeological study on its ear. 28,000 years? That's getting back to the realm of the cave paintings, That's really interesting. I'm going to look into that one. Thank you. Okay, reader, please.
Joan, please.
The four-faced, four-headed, four-natured Io. Is that correct?
You could say Iao if, I like, that's easy to say.
Included the father who had been individualized in the human family and transposed thence to the type of the deity as the Father in heaven. The Carthaginian Baal was portrayed with four faces corresponding to the four characters assigned to the Phoenician Io, according to the oracle of Apollo Clarius. Lucian has a Pythagorean dialogue in his Auction, in which Pythagoras asks, "How do you reckon?" The reply is 1, 2, 3, 4. Then Pythagoras says, "Do you see? In what you can see 4, there are 10, a perfect triangle, and our oath." This agrees with the one God who, on this line of combination, was perfected as the fourfold one, who included the triad, du and monad.
Due, yeah.
Oh, due, okay.
Yeah.
in the unity of a threefold totality. The number 10 was mystically said to be the begetter of souls, and the power of 10 was held to reside in the number 4. One form of the oath, then, was that of the fourth nature, the individualized fatherhood, the tetramorphic Io. Plutarch tells us this was the greatest oath amongst the Egyptians. That which is termed tetractus, or the sacred quaternion, as the decans of the 4 quarters, was, according to common report, the most sacred oath, and was called by them the world. This was a symbol of the fourfold divinity, based upon the 4 quarters, who included the nature of the father that followed the triad of mother, child, and pubescent youth. Here, the fourfold Io was sworn by instead of the threefold, as in the Greek oath.
Thank you. So in this fourfold Iao, we have a point of synchronicity with the Secret Doctrine webinar series, for Iao personifies the cardinal points, and thus the 4 Maharajas that we are in the middle of studying in the other in the Secret Doctrine webinar. Okay, we're going to have to hold off for the story of Quetzalcoatl's escape from the, quote, God and the fiery mirror till next time, because we're out of time. Tezcatlipoca. It's a fascinating study, and the relationship to Atlantis are quite interesting. So we'll start here next week, and thank you all. I think we have a webinar next week. Am I right?
Right. We had to readjust the schedule because of the full moon on the third Sunday. Okay, really quickly before we go, Vivian typed to everyone the information on the Bosnian Pyramid, and I copied that over and I emailed it to you, Francis. And Veronica says EAO equals I am the Alpha and the Omega that we talked about before.
Yeah, indeed. It's the sum total, but the sum total including manifestation, right? So you have the threefold, and then the unity of that threefold is the fourth principle. So it's a very different way of looking at fourness from the quaternary of, the manifested quaternary, or the 3 worlds of human existence, right? So, yes, and if you're interested in this, we really are knee deep in this study in the Secret Doctrine series. We'll be talking about the 4 Maharajas, which is this figure represented in next week. So tune in.
Okay, I don't think you have time to answer it, but Samuel also said, in light of the comments centering around when the pyramids were constructed, being confused with the chronology, how long ago do you think would that be from the day of their construction to our modern day, meaning this current 21st century? I thought the island of Atlantis should be at least a couple of million years behind us.
Yeah, but the last remnants were destroyed around 12,000 BC. The pyramids were constructed, according to Casey, and HPB tells us that it was the Atlanteans who came across that did the construction, not what she calls the Egypto something or other race that inhabited the land at the time, which was quite primitive. And they constructed, so really you could say that it was the Atlanteans that constructed the pyramid, those who came from that last remnant of, and they would have been the White Brotherhood, basically establishing a kind of axis mundi in the Great Pyramid for the 5th root race. I never had that association before. You can look at Meru, you can look at Olympus, but you can also look at the Great Pyramid as a form of Axis Mundi. Okay, that's all we have time for.
Okay, the next Stoa is the 3rd of October. And the next, the Secret Doctrine is next week because of our change in schedule. So thank you, everybody.
See you all then. Thank you.
Thank you, Francis.
My pleasure, always. Okay.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.